Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlogs. We've reached Henry VII, and this time we're looking at the subsection called Seizing the Throne and Trying to Keep It from 1485, the Battle of Bosworth, through to 1497. And what we're looking at in this particular episode is the methods by which Henry VII tried to establish control over England, and some sort of assessment as to why he was able to be successful, which of those methods was the most useful. Henry VII is seen as being one of the big successful kings of English history. He founded the Tudor dynasty, which of course transformed England in many ways. He had a financially stable reign. He ended the Wars of the Roses, the chaos of the preceding few decades. And some historians think he introduced a more modern form of kingship as well. But he is also criticised in numerous ways. For example, in 1485, he was the only real option to take over the throne. And arguably that's the case all through his reign. But nevertheless, he's consistently troubled by threats from Perkin Warbeck, from land at Simnel, which we'll talk about next time. He's criticised because of his income. When he died, his income was £113,000 a year, but Richard III's income was £120,000 a year, and Edward IV had been £160,000 a year. And all of this, despite the fact that Henry VII had access to a lot more land than either Edward or Richard had. Henry VII was also criticised because although he chose clever men to run his government, these men were so hated that his son, Henry VIII, executed two of them, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, as soon as he became king in 1510. Henry VII arguably used these men to run the country, or to run parts of the country, because he couldn't form a consensus amongst the nobility. So more than being a sign of meritocracy, they're kind of a sign of desperation. And allied to that, Henry VII is seen as being someone who kept the nobility down. There were no more overmighty subjects to threaten him. But the downside of this is that it weakened the nobility's ability to control their own backyards. And so this badly impacted law and order in Henry VII's reign. So Henry VII is one of those kings who is both kind of loved and also criticised in equal measure by historians. But it's worth remembering that he left England in 1471 and didn't return until 1485. When he left, he was aged 13. And so it's not surprising when he comes back that he's a suspicious man. He doesn't know which of the nobility he can trust. And this might explain in part his mum, Margaret Beaufort's role, overbearing role, some people say, but also the fact that he trusts people who can do the job, and also perhaps that he's very suspicious of people. Also, Henry VII adopts the French habit of having a bodyguard for kings. And again, this sort of shows off his suspicion, but it's not surprising because the French model of kingship was something that he'd spent time around. It's a sign of his exile as much as a sign of his paranoia here in England. Incidentally, these bodyguards go on to become the beefeaters of the Tower of London that we still have today. Anyhow, let's talk about how Henry VII tried to secure his hold on the throne after the Battle of Bosworth. Firstly, as I mentioned last time, he has a bloodline claim to the throne, and this is emphasised here and there, but it is quite tenuous. So he has a bloodline claim to the throne via his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who is a direct descendant of Edward III, via John of Gaunt's third wife. But John of Gaunt and the mother were not married when those children were born. So that's not great. Also, Henry had a claim by his father, who was the son of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's wife, but that was from her second marriage to Owen Tudor after Henry V had died. So the blood claims are very weak. Thus, Henry puts forward his main claim as being, in a speech to Parliament in November 1485, that he's the victor in the Battle of Bosworth. It showed God's approval and that his kind of might made it right, as it were. This was quite a dangerous precedent, it would be fair to say, because therefore anyone who defeated Henry VII in battle could claim that God had given them the kingship. Partly because of this, Henry employs a couple of other tricks. First of all, he dated his reign from the 21st of August, which was the day before the Battle of Bosworth, and that meant that anyone fighting on the other side at Bosworth were traitors legally, and their lands and titles were attainted, and the king could redistribute them as he saw fit, either keeping them for himself or giving them back and earning some gratitude from those nobility. He also made his coronation on the 30th of October, a week before Parliament sat, and this meant that Parliament could not say that they made him king. So Henry's kind of immediately acting to show that it's his strength and then not Parliament that has made him into king. He married Elizabeth of York after 4 months. He had promised to do this beforehand. He married her after 4 months becoming king. This helped end the dynastic struggles between Lancaster and York, so that was quite clever. It also stopped anyone else marrying her, which was also quite clever. If anyone else had married her, they would immediately have been producing a valid and strong rival to the throne. Henry then invents the Tudor rose to show the union of the Lancastrians and Yorkists kind of in a visual way. The red rose was not a big thing before. The white rose was kind of around. However, it was clear in this marriage that Henry VII was a dominant force. This was not the bringing together of two equals, and it was not Henry becoming king on the basis of his wife's claim to the throne. Both of those things were Henry was kind of strong in denying, not least because, or not least through, Elizabeth only being crowned 2 years after Henry. This was a sign that she was not his key to the throne, that he was king on his own merits. Part of the delay was that before marrying Elizabeth, she had to be unbastardized. Richard III had passed the law, the Titulus Regius, which had declared Elizabeth to be illegitimate because Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been illegitimate. Parliament repealed this and ordered all copies of the law to be destroyed, which again is a sign of the insecurity that Henry had. The marriage does appear to have been quite a decent one. Margaret Beaufort gets quite a lot of stick for sticking her oar in and being overbearing as the mother-in-law. But Henry is careful not to let his family become an issue like it had been for Edward IV, either in terms of like dominating patronage or by growing into rival claimants like George Duke of Clarence and Richard III in the end, of course, but also just in terms of jealousy at court and gifts generally. Henry VII keeps things very tight and controlled. It's also a very good marriage in terms of providing heirs. So Elizabeth actually had 7 children, and the first one, Arthur, was born in 1486. This immediately provides an infant, obviously, but an heir to the throne. Henry was born in 1491. So 2 heirs to the throne in the first 6 years. Edmund was born in 1499, and there were 4 girls as well. This together helps to stabilise things, even though Arthur died in 1502 after this unit ends. And Edmund, actually, the third son, had already died in 1500, and Elizabeth ended up dying in 1503 as well, all after our course ends. But nevertheless, this early kind of provision of heirs helps to stabilise things for Henry. Henry was quite a paranoid kind of guy. Some people see him as moving towards a more tyrannical model of kingship. And some people say that, Henry created a regime that ensured peace and stability, but this is due to his tighter controls on various things. So first of all, he has an intelligence network. He ideally, kind of normally, the nobility would be your intelligence network and a source of information from around the country. But because of the previous years of warfare, that was quite a flawed thing, even before Henry became king. In fact, Edward IV had used spies, and in a nice twist of that, we know that partly because Clarence and Warwick had both sent letters to Edward IV via the spies to try and misinform him. And we know that Henry VI had paid informants back in the 1450s, and that Edward IV had paid Scottish informers in the 1460s, which had led to the capture of Henry VI. But Henry VII perhaps kind of expands that and makes it more consistent. He used scouts to keep tabs on the Cornish rebels in 1497. He placed people in foreign courts, ambassadors, to keep them informed of what's going on there. He uses Calais as a base for espionage. In the 1490s, an attempt was made to infiltrate the court of Burgundy because Margaret of Burgundy was there plotting energetically against Henry. Informers were quite useful in the case of Perkin and Warbeck, as we'll go on to see tomorrow, or next time rather. Henry VII also developed the use of ciphers, although that's a bit later on, after 1505. The other thing that Henry does, apart from spies and informants, is that he uses financial policies to try and keep his nobility in check, and in particular bonds. Bonds were used as payments for either privileges or as fines, and they were often placed on those whose loyalty was questionable, people that Henry thought might disturb the peace. Under Henry, more than half the peerage paid bonds, some of them more than once. They were not a new thing, but they were being used on a massive scale. They weren't always called in, but the threat of them was often enough to ensure good behaviour. The best example of this, or perhaps one of the most notorious examples of this, was in 1507, which is a little bit after our unit ends. But Lord Abergavenny was fined £70,000, but Henry VII accepted £500 a year for 10 years if there were no further disloyalty suspected. As I said already, the heart of these policies were Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, and they were so unpopular that they were arrested after Henry died, sent to the Tower, and in 1510 they were beheaded on the orders of Henry VIII. The other thing, finally, was that Henry VII was very careful not to create a lot of new peers, lords. If any were executed or disinherited under Henry VII, rather than reversing that, he tended to follow through in more cases than previous monarchs and claim the lands back for himself. This is successful in the sense that we don't have any Richard of Yorks or Earl of Warwicks emerging during Henry's rule, but it does perhaps lead to, as I said at the start, some problems around the country of the nobility not being able or willing to keep unrest in check at times. So, in terms of Henry's methods at gaining control of the country and stabilising his reign, he does this through marriage, he does this through financial things, he does this through spying, and he does it through legal means as well. Getting rid of the titulus regis, and by making his reign start from the day before Bosworth. All of this is very successful. That Henry doesn't really have, he doesn't have as big a threat to his throne as, let's think, Richard or Edward IV or Henry VI before him. Going back to Henry V, probably the most secure king since then. And he sets up the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that is going to last the next 100 years without serious threat to that either, despite the fact that there's a number of issues about heirs to come. So Henry is very successful, and probably he's successful partly because of the lack of options against him, but also because of these things he has tried, and probably the most important of them, I would say, is the marriage to Elizabeth of York at the start, because that really does remove any kind of Yorkist or any significant Yorkist threat. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you next time when we'll talk about the threats that do emerge, nevertheless, to Henry's reign. Cheerio.